It's holiday season. Christmas is less than a month away. If you're anything like me, you are terrible about putting off gift buying. But don't fret. There are several exclusive offers and early holiday deals at Primos.com. Everything from customized gifts from the custom mill shop, gift guides that you can click on that'll guide you through if the person you're buying a gift for is a deer hunter, a turkey hunter, predator hunter, whatever that person may be into. Or you can just go and scroll through all the exclusive deals that they have available. Everything from blinds, bow slings, bow cases, and a lot more. Check that out at Primos.com. Also, did you know that you could win a brand new Polaris XP1000 North Star Edition just by being an onX Hunt Elite member? It's true. If you have an active onX Hunt Elite account by January 7th, 2024, you are automatically entered to win one of two brand new Polaris Ranger XP1000s North Star Edition. The North Star Edition is like their top of the line creme de la creme and has all the bells and whistles you can imagine. It's incredible. And again, to enter to win, all you have to do is be an onX Hunt Elite member. So, if you're an onX Hunt Elite member already, thank you. We greatly appreciate it. If you're not an onX Hunt Elite member, there's 1,000,001 reasons to become an Elite member already, and now we're going to give you another one. It's going to give you a chance to win a brand new Polaris. So become an onX Hunt Elite member today, and I hope you enjoy the show.
Rip is on point right up over this choke cherry tree here, right behind it. Good work, my friend.
Thank you.
Heck yeah. Good job, Rip.
Last week, we took our first in-depth look into the story of quail here in the Southeast. We heard from a man who has lived and hunted quail in Mississippi long enough to recall a time when you wouldn't catch an odd look for pulling up to a Mississippi gas station with an English pointer in your truck. We also heard from a man who was born and raised in Tennessee and grew an interest in quail mainly from the stories from his dad on how things used to be. Last week's episode was mainly meant to maybe pull on your heartstrings a tad, to possibly get you emotionally invested and maybe thinking about a type of hunting that you haven't even tried yet. And maybe you haven't tried it because it's not readily available to you like deer, squirrel, or turkey hunting is. Unfortunately, if you live in Mississippi, or most places in the Southeast, quail hunting's not readily available to you. But it used to be. This week, we're going to look hard into the question of why. Why did we lose our quail, and what exactly caused it? But first, before we dive in, I'm going to pose a few questions to make you think and also get your mind rolling in the right direction for what you're going to hear in this episode. If you were to hop in your vehicle and take a drive around your neighborhood, down the local highway or interstate, down an old country road maybe, if you looked out your window, what would you see? Buildings, ag fields, pasture, blocks of timber, whatever you see around where you live. Have you ever stopped and thought about whether or not it's always been that way? I've come to learn that what we grow up with, we tend to assume that that's just simply the way things have always been. For example, the Mississippi that I've pretty much known for my entire life has been dominated by vast stretches of loblolly pine plantation. But when I stop and think about it, it can't have always been that way. Thousands upon thousands of acres of pine trees planted in rows simply does not occur naturally. So what was there before? And what effect did it have when we made it that way? Kicking us off this week is Dr. Mark McConnell. Mark is a professor of upland birds at Mississippi State University. He has a PhD in forest resources, a master's in wildlife and fisheries science, and we can just safely say that he knows more about this subject than any of us do, myself included, if that's not already been made blatantly obvious. Mark is going to help all of us understand quail on a more detailed level. What's the historic range of a bobwhite quail?
Man, so there's several quail species, of specifically the bobwhite. A large portion of the eastern United States, they were up into southern Wisconsin, all the way out to Nebraska, parts of Texas, even down into certain parts of Mexico, from all through the southeast, even in Pennsylvania, they were historically part of the bobwhite range. So vast distribution throughout the U.S.
They covered the southeast region. Not so much anymore, but they were here.
100%. And like I said, and not just the Southeast. Like they were also in the upper Midwest, into Pennsylvania. Yeah, I mean, every state in the Southeast historically had a bobwhite. Yeah.
We used to have a lot of quail. We know that. What led to this huge quail decline? Like why did, let's say for instance, like central Mississippi, Alabama, why did we once have a lot of quail and then there was this huge decline and loss of them? What?
Yeah, so the easy part of that question is what they declined throughout the range. Some parts of the country, the decline was steeper than others, but the overall reason across the range is the same, and then you can break it down by the specific reasons. But the overall reason was a loss of habitat. I know people hate when I get a lot of pushback when you say that because, well, that's too simple. That's really all it was. The landscape changed. How we managed the landscape changed, and it changed dramatically. And I'll give you an example in a second. But it changed in Nebraska, eastern Nebraska, and it changed in South Georgia. It all changed based off changes in farming practices, how we manage forests, a lack of prescribed fire. And when you collectively add all those things together, there's just less and less quail habitat on the landscape. What happened in Mississippi, as an example, and a lot of the Southeast states, if you go to, and I wrote an article several years ago about this, if you go to any property you're familiar with, and you're going to see a predominance of fescue, tall fescue, Bermuda grass or Bahia grass, tons of row crop, and then when you do get into a forest, especially in the deep South, it's a monoculture, high stem density pine forest that rarely gets any fire, if any.
When you say monoculture,
all the same,
gotcha.
Just nothing but loblolly pine trees.
Yes,
planted in farm that we're farming pine trees.
Right.
So we plant them in rows and do the same thing. So, like in Mississippi, if you can find a property that isn't dominated by fescue, which is no good for quail for the most part. I mean, the expansion of fescue has been a negative. We used to not farm fence row to fence row. Right. Yeah. We used to have weedy areas around the thing. If you talk to old timers about hunting quail in the deep South, they were hunting the fence rows and the brushy, weedy areas in between ag fields. That's where they found birds. Right. And then, we don't do prescribed fire anymore. So that's what happened here. But it was the same everywhere. Right. Agricultural expansion, intensification. And I just keep using Nebraska as an example. But any of the states that had quail in these areas, you have a decline from, we just took away what habitat there was. And at one point, they were kind of the most popular game bird, at least in the Southeast, but in a lot of parts of the country, because they were everywhere.
Right.
And so you stop burning, you start farming exotic grasses, you start farming row crops more intensively and expanding, and you start taking fire away from the forest. All that combines to show that there's just not enough habitat for quail. The things that get most of the attention for quail are red imported fire ants, coyotes, what else? Any predator to blame. And those things certainly don't help, but they are not the primary reason. So,
and I've seen a similar, and this won't be a shock to you, but I've seen a similar, I guess, blaming of those particular, kind of like hot button topics towards, they say the same thing about turkeys.
Yeah. Hell, sometimes they blame the decline of quail on turkeys.
Really?
Oh, I still hear that every year.
I have not heard that one.
I'll tell that story in a second. I'll let you finish your thought.
Are the turkeys predating on the quail?
Yeah, it's a fun story. I'll keep going. I'll come back to it.
What I was saying is, it's everyone down here. It's my hypothesis, so to speak, is nowadays we live in such an instant gratification world. I think people want to find that silver bullet, that one big factor that they go, if we fix this, problem solved. And if there's anything that I learned, like you and I talked about, we both were at Mississippi State University at the same time. You were further ahead than I was, but I remember in Dr. Robbie Kroger's class, applied aquatic and terrestrial ecology. He's like, you can never just do one thing.
That's right.
It's impossible. And the same thing, there's never just one factor. Never. It's never one factor.
We have no silver bullets in wildlife management, but so I think it's 100% everybody wants a silver bullet. But I think it's also, and this gets into a little just human psychology, which I'm obviously no expert in. But if you think about the things I just described that lead to the quail decline, those are all things we voluntarily did on the landscape. And nobody inherently wants to go, yes, what we did collectively as a society or as farmers or as pine farmers or as landowners was the problem, right? Nobody wants to take that on the nose and say that was, we did this. When you will talk to some landowners who will flat out say, we did everything in our power to get rid of quail for several years, right? We were actively working against them. We just didn't realize it maybe, or not everybody understood it. So a lot of times it's like, look, we know what affects these birds. We know how to make more birds. We've figured that out. It's really an issue of getting enough landowners to do it, so you can kind of create enough quail in the landscape to bring them back to what most people want is, maybe huntable numbers, but a lot of people just want to, encounter them. But going back to the fire ants and everything, Lenny Brennan wrote a paper years ago. He's an endowed professor of quail research at Texas A&M. And he talked about how the fire ants and all this stuff, it's all a red herring, right? It's just something that we're using as an excuse.
Yeah, a scapegoat.
Yeah. So, red imported fire ants, they obviously aren't great, but you can go to the Red Hills of South Georgia. There's more quail there than you could ever possibly, shoot into. And there's fire ant mounds everywhere. There's parts of Texas where there's really abundant quail populations. There's fire ant mounds there. They don't help, but habitat is the ultimate factor that we need. So going to the turkey thing, I'd heard some older people growing up say that, the turkeys caused the quail decline. And I thought they were joking. And they weren't. And I know a guy in Oklahoma right now that he's like, man, it's those damn turkeys. And so I looked into it because I was like, all right, I keep hearing this. Something's going on here.
Yeah.
I think in the 70s somewhere, and I wrote about this in, I think in one of those Gamekeepers articles I wrote several years ago. I think it was in the 70s in Florida somewhere. Somebody was sitting in a blind trapping turkeys or something, and they watched a turkey come by and I think either eat the eggs out of the nest or eat something happened, right? And let's be honest, everything will eat a quail. Tall Timbers Research Station used to have a video of a deer eating quail eggs out of the nest, right? James Martin, who you'll interview later, he had a study down there where a bullfrog ate a radioed quail chick.
Really?
Yeah, it had a little antenna. When they caught the bullfrog, the chick's feet and the antenna you could see sticking out of it. So that doesn't mean
bullfrogs are the problem.
That's
the silver bullet.
And as much as I would love to blame deer for the quail decline, nothing would please me more to blame pine goats for that. That's not what happened, right? Yeah. So what happened was this person observed this turkeys. I can't remember if it was chicks or eggs, whatever, but they ate one or two, and they wrote an article about it in some magazine.
Yeah.
And this was at the time where, keep in mind, we're talking about this early 70s. The turkey restoration was on the upswing, right, in the Southeast. We were restocking turkeys everywhere. It's also about the time the quail decline had already been going since the 1880s, 1890s. Yeah. But we didn't really start talking about it outside of the quail biologist until about the 50s and 60s, right? So you see everyone's talking about quail decline. We're restocking turkeys. People are seeing turkeys everywhere. And people started noticing, hey, I'm seeing a lot of turkeys. And you know what I'm not seeing a lot of is quail. And the perfect storm of a conspiracy theory was born. And I still, about once a year, I still hear somebody that say, well, isn't it the turkeys that ruined the quail? And I'm like, no, not really.
Well, I must say, I think we can. I've never heard that theory.
Well, that makes
before.
me feel better. Good. Maybe it's finally been dispelled.
I've never in a million years heard blame it on turkeys.
Well, maybe I shouldn't have said anything.
I
probably reversed it.
No, it's interesting. I find it funny. Like it
is very funny.
Yeah. One thing. So digging around, like I kicked this podcast, this quail podcast project off because of a personal interest that I grew in quail. And so I've been learning a lot, just throughout this process. I'm constantly astounded by how much effect we humans as a species have on a landscape. It's like and I think we downplay it sometimes. You kind of alluded to it earlier. Like no one wants to say we did that. We're the ones who covered everything in pine trees and had this effect. I mean, because in some degree, you would like to think those people back then, when the decline started happening, they weren't thinking about it. But still, it's like how big of an impact we actually have without even realizing it.
Yeah, and without question. And the sad part is, collectively, we'll just take landowners in general, but in the Southeast where I've spent most of my career, collectively, a lot of landowners were all doing the same thing, right? We were all farming fence row to fence row. We were, they were converting to fescue. We were doing all, and the quail community promoted fescue at one point, right? We were so desperate to cover the soil, and we were like, oh yeah, plant fescue, that'll be great. And that was, one of our biggest mistakes. But what's interesting now is you've had such a decline and we've had such an impact on the landscape. Now when you find landowners, because it's usually just one landowner here or there, sometimes it's a lot, who are really trying to restore quail. We got in this situation as a collective body of landowners all doing the same thing. Now it's hard to get all the landowners to do the same thing. So like here at Prairie Wildlife in West Point, where we work with Mr. Jimmy Bryan to do a lot of quail conservation, he's doing just about as much as you can do on a working farm to maintain it as a working farm or productive farm or profitable farm and have quail. All right, he's doing just about everything he can. But unless all the landowners around him do it, there's only so high his quail population can get, right? Because at the end of the day, it's just one piece of property and you need that landscape effect that drove quail to decline. You need that landscape effect to get quail back.
To reverse it.
Yeah, and now we're never going to get back. I say reverse it. Yeah. I tell people all the time, like, we're never going to get quail numbers back to where they were, say, in the 40s or the 50s, right? That is, in my opinion, that is not a fruitful endeavor.
That's what Dr. Craig Harper said. That made me sad.
It is. But so when people ask me, because I think I was on a podcast somewhere and they said, can we ever get quail back to huntable numbers? And I said, well, it depends on what you mean. Huntable numbers in the 50s? No, the landscape has changed way too much. But, and you'll hear some old guys say they used to go out and find 8 or 10 coveys in a day. And that was true. That was very easy to do in many parts of the Southeast. Now, if a landowner or several landowners are working collectively to really try to get quail conservation on the ground and they're following the science and doing the best they can, what I tell people is you just have to lower your expectation. Now, going out in a morning hunt and finding 2 to 3 coveys is considered success, right? Years ago, that would have been a very bad day, right? Yeah. So we just have to change our expectations, right? We can have huntable quail numbers again, but it's not going to be a tailgate full of bobwhite at the end of the day. Right? Yeah. It may be 3 or 4 or 5 that you shoot, and that's probably what the future of quail hunting looks like. And for every quail hunter I know, that's more than enough.
That's what Andy Edwards and I were talking about about the measure of success and how you grade that. So it's like, to me, and like I said, we live within a hunting community where your whitetail hunting and your waterfowl and your turkeys, big game gets most of the shine.
Yep.
The term limiting out gets a lot of shine. Different grading scale on how you judge success.
Yeah, Tag Robinson has a great quote. He goes, "We're going to make quail hunting cool again." And he and I were joking about it, and something about upland hunting and duck hunting too. But duck hunting is a much easier sale because you're just, on average, duck hunt. If you even have a clue what you're doing, you're going to encounter birds. Whether you harvest, you're going to see them and call all day. At least you're going to see them, right?
Yeah.
Upland hunting's different, right? You don't often see that many birds per hour of effort, right? So it's a whole different mentality. But going about how to make it an easy sell. So if you look at any of the hunting magazines, upland hunting magazines, all right, what are they selling? Cool shotguns, cool dogs, cigars, bourbon, right? Sometimes wine. I mean, upland hunting kind of hits all those points. Those are all my favorite things, and so it's I used to never be I was a minimalist type duck hunter. I'd never spent a lot of time on gear and stuff. And as an upland hunter, I mean, I get really into the smell of your chaps and stuff.
Yeah.
These things that just I don't go on a quail hunt without a cigar in my pocket. That's largely Mr. Jimmy's fault. So this whole part of upland hunting is just different. And the dogs, it's not like duck hunting, which I love duck hunting and with my dog, but they're sitting there, you're not watching them work the whole time. You're waiting for something, but in upland hunting, you're just watching the dog the whole time.
Yeah.
And that is, a day behind a bird dog's better than just about any other day.
I would strongly agree. Yeah, I would strongly agree with that. What was when you started in your role and started working some with upland birds, what was the general consensus where you worked of the state of quail in the Southeast? What were you working from, so to speak?
I'd say in most of the public's eyes that I spoke to back then, most people, and even some wildlife professionals, they were like, "Hey, don't start your career on quail." Right? Quail, we were talking at lunch, most people have written off quail already.
Yeah.
Right? And then they would say, "Well, look, if you want to work with quail, you're going to have to work in agriculture, and don't try to be a wildlife biologist in an agricultural landscape." People were trying to talk me out of it, honestly. And perfectly full truthfulness here, that probably made me want to do it more because I didn't like the idea that someone said it's not worth it to work in this landscape, because I'd worked on a farm. I'd worked with landowners. I knew landowners had a conservation mindset when they could fit it in. So to me, that was kind of the challenge. But yeah, no, in general, I mean, when I started my undergraduate degree, I worked in Louisiana with a quail biologist there named Cody Sedetall. And Cody, he was fairly optimistic and taught me a lot. And then when I did my master's, I was working with Wes Berger, who was, at the time one of the leading quail researchers, and he was very optimistic. So I was always around optimistic people in the quail world. Mm-hmm. Outside of the quail world, but in the wildlife community, a lot of people were not. They didn't think it was a good way to focus my career. Right. But then once you see a quail, and if you're lucky enough to hold one, there's just no going back. And what really got me excited about quail. Because I really didn't see one. I grew up in North Louisiana. I didn't see one. I was 21 years old. Sure. In Arkansas, for that matter. Yeah. Coming out of a Ceresia patch, which is the last place you want to. Bad first experience. I was big into burning and manipulation, and they call it the firebird. So that's what got me into it. Was like, hey, this is a bird. This is a critter that I can manage, and people want me to light fires. Yeah. And the fire probably is what really sold me initially. Gotcha. Because you're a 19-year-old kid, and someone gives you a drip torch. I mean,
tells you it's constructive
and tell you you're supposed to do it, So that was what really helped me. Yeah. But yeah, the general consensus in the quail world, I'll give the quail community credit. They remain cautiously optimistic. I've been in quail research, for I guess over maybe 15 or so years now. The quail world remains cautiously optimistic. The wildlife community outside of the quail world, not nearly as optimistic.
Yeah, I can see that just from where I'm at. Yeah. It seems, I mean, like you said, for the most part, to find someone that is optimistic and or willing to talk about quail, they're going to be very passionate about it. Someone that doesn't care much about quail hunting, most of them, they're like, it's done. It's kind of a dying sport.
Yeah, and Dr. James Martin, who you'll interview later, he wrote an article, a column for I think Quail Forever's magazine in this last issue maybe, where I read it, but I'm paraphrasing it here. He pretty much says the number one ingredient to be successful in quail management is just passion. Like, you've got to be obsessed with this bird and willing to devote so much effort, because we see it a lot. A lot of landowners, they start and they go pretty good for a while, but if you don't just have a passion for this bird, it's very hard to maintain, that level of momentum and progress.
Yeah, that's what Dr. Harper said something similar. He said most people, when we lay out for them what they have to do to manage bobwhites, they just don't do it because the work's too intensive for them. Yeah. Do you have anything specific project-wise right now that you're excited about that's going on?
Well, I just finished up one project here at Prairie Wildlife. That student actually defends here in a couple weeks. That was one of her parts of her project was it was the first ever investigation into roosting habitat during the breeding season. So all the roosting information we have on where quail roost, it's all from the fall when they're in coveys, right? No one had ever investigated where they roost at night during the breeding season, which is about 6-ish months plus for the year in the deep south. I mean,
really?
Oh yeah. I mean, breeding season here, we generally just cut it off April 15th to, damn near the end of August often. And this year, a lot of the Southeast, especially in Mississippi, we had a lot of late hatches because it was dry for so long. Yeah. They breed. I mean, you'll start hearing, they'll start singing a little before April 15th, but generally by April 15th, you've got a bunch of males singing, doing the bob white, and then they'll nest repeatedly as much as they can, essentially, whether their nest hatches or not. They'll just keep going. As a whole bunch of the birds nest multiple times, not all of them. So it's a really long breeding season. Okay. So it's 6 months out of the year that we didn't know if they're not on a nest, because if they're on the nest, obviously they spend the night on the nest. But where do they spend the night when they're not on a nest? Yeah. And it just drove me crazy not knowing that, because we say it's one of the most well-studied species avian species in the country, and it is in terms of number of publications. But it just infuriated me that I didn't know because they typically roost. They're not in coveys, obviously, they're individuals. So she had to go out at night and roost them in the evening, and then go back the next morning and see if they were still there. And we're looking at kind of what type of habitat they're selecting, what type of vegetation cover they're selecting, or where they sleep at night during the breeding season. We have a pretty good idea of what they do during the fall. And I'm really excited about that one because it's just new information. It's stuff we just didn't know. We're finding out that there's some similarities to where coveys roost in terms of the vegetative structure. There's also a lot of differences that we weren't expecting because they're individuals, right? They don't have the same vigilance that, say, the covey has. And then they don't need to stay warm because it's summertime in Mississippi, so it's 1,000 degrees all day long. So we're teasing apart some of that. That's really cool. I've got a quail study down at the Jones Ecological Research Center. They call it Itchaway. It's southern Georgia. Really excited about that one because that's a 29,000 acre longleaf pine station they've never done quail research before. So we've got the first radio tag quail there ever, and looking at a bunch of different things. But also one of the cool things is looking at, because fire is such an integral part of that management system, is longleaf, right? You just got to burn it, and the staff there just does this amazing job of doing the burns. So I wanted to see, okay, after a burn, if a birds are in this area, then after the burn, how long does it take them to come back? Because like with turkeys, and we see those quail too, we joke about that, like they eat fried grasshoppers, right? They'll come into a burn, but we don't really, and we've all seen that. Marcus Lashley has shown that. A whole bunch of people have shown that, but we really don't know how prevalent that is. I mean, is every bird doing that? Are they all doing? How long are they doing? How many days? Like I wanted to know this stuff because there's a huge risk for them to be out there. There's very little cover right after a burn.
Right.
And so I wanted to look at how often they're going out there as individuals, and then how long and what point does the vegetation get as it's regrowing before they go back in there kind of at the same rate they were before.
Gotcha.
So just trying to understand a little bit, dial in a little bit on what they do after a fire.
Yeah.
I've got a bunch of other projects, but so most of my research is quail, a little bit of turkeys, and some grassland bird stuff.
How much research do you do here at Prairie Wildlife? Like a lot, right?
Yeah, I think in the last few years I've had, we monitor the place year round. We've got an ARU study, an automated recording unit study, where we put out these kind of passive recording units, stuff Chamberlain and them have done and Galsby have done on turkeys for a while. Just kind of going off the stuff they started with those crip birds. And we've got that. We've did some vegetation manipulation studies out here. Olivia study was out here. In general, we've had 3 or 4 different projects, some larger than others, going on this property.
One of the things we talk about, it's like one of the most stark differences between here and like out west is just the amount of public land, whereas here most everything is privately owned. And so what becomes valuable is the landowner, because the landowner at the end of the day makes the decisions on what happens on that property. So how valuable to someone that does what you do for a living, that how valuable is a place like Prairie Wildlife that treats this place like they do?
It's probably the most important thing to being able to answer these types of questions. Finding landowners that are willing to do the work, are passionate about it, and then here's the big one, and willing to let you do research out there. Because sometimes they've got an operation out here. They're a farming operation. They got a hunting operation. There's times when we're not, we can be challenging to that because of certain things we need to do. So to find landowners that care enough about the science to let you do research and who value the science that you produce and are willing to take the science and go, okay, let's change what we've done. Right. So like at Prairie, Mr. Jimmy's changed a lot of things over the years based off what the science has told us. You don't get that in a lot of landowners. He can be hard-headed sometimes, but you don't get that all the time. So, and like I said, most of this is privately owned. 70% of the lower 48 is not industrial private landowners, some stat like that. So the future of quail conservation is not going to be on public land.
Exactly.
Right. It's on private. Now, shout out to my state agency here, and all the state agencies, public lands, I have a study on public land looking at kind of the scale of the impact of WMAs managed for quail and kind of how far that radiates out beyond the WMA. And, we're doing that. And we need those public areas as showcases and to show the public, hey, you can keep this bird around and increase their numbers through active management. So, but yeah, having landowners willing to do this, we've got a few of them around the state that we work with, and they're not by any means all of them, but it is hard to find that combination of passion, interest, and willingness to cooperate with a university.
If I told you, going back to that cautiously optimistic, if I asked you to take the cautious part out of it and look ahead 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, in a best case scenario, what could the forecast
of quail in the Southeast look like?
Wow, that's a good question. If we maintain the current level of energy and effort across the NGOs and the private landowners, I think we'll slowly tick up a little bit. If we can find a way to reinvigorate more landowners with this and show them that it can be labor intensive, but once you kind of get going, like at Prairie Wildlife, a perfect example, like there's a lot of stuff we're still working on, but we're pretty much in what I call maintenance mode. We're pretty much at the point where all we're doing is doing the same manipulations through fire and disking and rotating, and we've kind of reclaimed all the ground we're going to reclaim, and it's just maintenance. It's a regimented, prescription year after year with very little tweaks. Once you get to that point, it's not that hard, right? But yeah, I mean, I don't know what kind of number you're looking for or what kind of answer, but there's no reason to not be optimistic for quail conservation across the Southeast. The science has very clearly demonstrated what makes quail. I would argue the next phase of research really needs to, and I've got a few students looking at this, really needs to be looking at the psychology of the landowner and what it takes. What do they need to get there, right? Because I think we know how to grow quail. Yeah, we know how to keep quail alive. We know how to manage them. Not to say there's not always new things we can learn, but we understand that. We got to figure out how to get it on the landscape and keep it on the landscape. And that, I think, if we can figure that out, man, what I would hope is anybody who wants to hunt quail and understand, you're not going to find 10 coveys a day, right, on average. Anybody who wants to hunt quail has enough public and or private opportunities that anybody who wants to go has enough justification to buy a bird dog.
Now, I don't know about y'all, but giving somebody a reason to buy a bird dog is a cause that I can 100% get behind. Up next, we're going to hear from John Mark Curtis. John Mark is a farm bill biologist that works for Quail Forever right here in the state of Mississippi. His job mostly involves assisting landowners in designing, developing, funding habitat improvements specifically on private lands. John Mark is very knowledgeable on the specific habitat needs. Also, his perspective and opinion on the reason for the decline and the downfall for quail right here in the Southeast. Here is John Mark.
So, first quail covey I ever saw, I was about 10 years old, maybe 11. And we had just gotten done deer hunting. I was deer hunting with my dad, and it's me and my little brother, and we're walking around on our family property. My grandfather owns a little land in Montgomery County. And so we're out there walking, and we're walking into a recently planted CRP hardwood stand. And, it's about, of course, at this point I'm yay tall, like the scale is all thrown off for me, but it's, it's shrubbier. The trees haven't closed canopy type stuff yet, so there's a lot of briars in there, all that sort of thing. And we get a little ways in there, and all of a sudden I hear, and I don't even know what's going on. I just look up and like, oh, there's birds, So, and my dad's like, oh, those are quail. Like, why haven't I seen this before? And that led to all these questions that we've already talked about of well, why don't we have more of those? Or like, well, what happened to quail? And, and I think about that a lot. Like that was a moment for me. And thinking about like why we don't have quail anymore. If you go to that stand right now, it's closed canopy, hardwood, 20, 30-year-old stand, no understory whatsoever, just leaf litter. So that's not quail habitat.
There's no place for a quail to be.
No, I'll never see a quail in that stand. Never say never. We'll cut it at some point, but that's what happened to quail. Yeah, and I challenge people because I get this all the time. People want to talk about other factors that led to quail decline and that sort of thing. But if you hunted quail back in the day, go back and look at those spots where you used to find birds, and go back and really think about it. Like, what did that hedgerow what happened to that hedgerow you used to get quail out of, or that weedy field where you used to flush a bird or two, or whatever the case may be. Go and look at it and see look at it honestly. Would a quail live there anymore? And a lot of the times the answer is no.
What kind of habitat does a quail need?
So quail are a shrubland obligate species. Basically, the things when you're okay, let me back up a little bit. when you're thinking about bobwhite quail or any species for that matter, it comes down to habitat, what that species needs from a food, water, shelter, space perspective. Having, you know, all the things that it needs arranged on the landscape in a way where it can use it. So with bobwhite quail, from a food perspective, in the summer months, they're eating a lot of insects. In the winter months, they're eating a lot of seeds. So from food, we need stuff that are, you know, producing on both of those ends. A quail is a very small ground nesting, ground dwelling bird. So it's very important that at ground level, there's bare ground and open space for quail to be able to move around very easily. Quail chick, when it is first born, is about the size of your thumbnail. So when you think of it, yeah, that's pretty small, right?
That's small.
Yeah. So
everyone, if you're listening to this podcast right now, unless you're driving, which some of you might be, if you're at a red light, stop and look at the size of your thumbnail and realize that's the size of a quail chick.
Yeah, when they first hatch.
That's crazy.
And not only that, you know, quail aren't like a bluebird or something. They don't stay in the nest. As soon as they hatch, they have to get out of the nest and they have to go and start finding their own food and feeding themselves. So when you look at a field, for example, and like to us, it looks very open. It looks great. But then you kind of peel back, you know, the brushier stuff and look at ground level. If you see a lot of turf forming grass, like Bermuda grass or Bahia grass or something like that, for example, imagine yourself the size of your thumbnail trying to walk through that and realize how difficult that would be to you.
Right.
So, and like, if they're not able to get to enough food to sustain themselves, say a hen lays a nest in a field like that, the chicks hatch, they, you know, get out of the nest and they start going, and that's what they run into. They're not going to make it very long. So, you know, and without recruitment, you're not going to have quail for very long on a property. Right. So you need open at ground level, but also cover to provide shade and to, you know, provide them places to hide, essentially. On top of that, you also need shrubby escape cover. So you need areas that of, you know, thicker brambles and things like that. Think blackberry thickets and that sort of thing, kind of spread across the property. That way, on average, a quail can fly about 120 yards-ish. You know, there's exceptions to that, obviously, but that's the number that gets thrown around. They are not going to want to be much farther than that from some sort of escape cover, because nothing knows how delicious it is as well as a bobwhite quail. You know, like they know everything out there wants to eat them. Yeah. So they need to be able to have, you know, places where they can escape and where they can get away. A pretty good example of this, we usually go hunt in Kansas. Yeah. You know, and have been for the last couple of years. And it took 2 years of going up there, but I can remember the exact spot I was standing in. We had just gotten into a covey of quail. And we don't find all that many quail because we're usually up there pheasant hunting, right? We're pushing these giant grass fields, these CRP fields. And you've pheasant hunted a good bit, right?
Typically, and exactly like what you're saying. Typically, we're pheasant hunting, and if we find quail, we're like, oh, cool.
Yeah. They're kind of, I hate to call a quail a bonus bird because I love them way more than I do pheasants, but, you know, it's like, that's the way we had approached it for, you know, several years. And you're walking fields and fields of big blue stem Indian grass that's this tall and thick as all get out, and you're not finding quail out there.
Right.
After that covey, all of a sudden something clicked in my head. It's like, oh my goodness, y'all in 2 years of coming out here, you haven't found a single covey of quail that wasn't, you know, closer than 100 yards to a shrub thicket, you know, some sort of sand plum. Yeah. And that's remained true every other time we've gone out there too, because they need that cover. And if you think about those real thick CRP plantings, you know, back to what we were talking about them needing bare ground and that sort of thing to be able to move around easily, because their legs are pretty short, even an adult quail compared to a pheasant. You know, that becomes pretty garbage from a quail perspective, you know, pretty quickly.
Yeah. So we were talking about, we used to have a lot of quail. Okay, well, why? Sure. You know, and it's hard for somebody, even for me. It's like my knowledge of what my state along Mississippi and the rest of the Southeast, it's predominantly timbered. Yep. It's a whole lot of loblolly pine. That's right. And it's like trying to grasp how different this landscape looked back in the 1920s, you know, when quail populations were astonishingly better than they were now.
Oh, even absolutely.
The 1800s and the Civil War. You know? And so that's why I asked that question.
Gotcha. Well, from a Mississippi perspective anyway, when you think about that landscape, you know, there was a lot more sharecropping and like small patch farming. And, you know, people are planting, you know, we don't have combines, tractors, as big fields as we, you know, do now. Everybody was doing a lot more by hand or with mule or whatever else. And you had a lot, and not only that, but our food supply system wasn't nearly what it is now. So everything you were eating, you were growing locally, or somebody was. So you had a huge variety of crops that were being produced. People fallowed fields, which was huge for bobwhite quail because, you know, that first year of growth, you get a lot of stuff like annual ragweed, partridge pea, you know, plants like that are really great for quail. And it creates what we call brood fields, which is exactly what we were talking about earlier with that like real bare ground, because it was disked that year before, you know, or plowed, I should say. And, you know, with some of these annual weeds growing up and providing shade and providing food resources and things like that. So you had that spread out all across the place. And we didn't have as many trees as we do now, by any means. And people, probably one of the biggest things too, like, is people were more present on the landscape. It really is what it comes down to. Quail are a species of disturbance. If you're not constantly disturbing your property, you're not going to have bobwhite quail. So, and whether that's fire or disking or what have you. And I think you talked a little bit about this with when you were talking to Craig Harper. I listened to that podcast, and you were talking about how you have some friends who, you know, have started burning their properties, and all of a sudden now there's quail. It's like, it's pretty cool. Like, you know, they respond very quickly to habitat being put in place, or, you know, having the resources that they need to be successful. It's really cool. I'm honestly at a point now where I don't believe there's anywhere in Mississippi where if you don't build it, they'll come. You know, when I first started this job, I worried about that. Like, where's the source population? I haven't ever seen that be an issue. For me, a lot of it is the family thing too, right? Because that's quail hunting, something both my granddads did as well. You know, and you know, that's something that I always wanted to do. And I grew up asking that question. Like, you know, people would talk about quail, and I'd be like, well, why don't we have quail? Like, well, we just don't have them anymore. And like and phrased in a way where it's like, well, we can't have them anymore. And like,
you're talking is like, well, that's just over.
And that just, I don't know. I'm not a very bullheaded person, but some things just annoy me. And anyway, I think that's really what inspired me to end up in the field that I'm in, is like, well, no, it can't just be no. Like, there's got to be a reason. Like, what's the reason? And can we do anything? And that sort of thing. But honestly, I'm cautiously optimistic is what I'll call it.
That is the exact term McConnell used.
Is it really?
Cautiously optimistic.
So I keep in mind that I'm early enough in my career that I'm still like very optimistic about everything. Like, I'm not the old soul who's been beating away at this for 30 years and like trying to make a difference and not seeing anything happen. But like, I really think we are poised at a point, a breaking point of sorts, where the science behind managing for the two things that we love in the South, especially in Mississippi as much as anything, deer and turkeys, a lot of the science is now pointing to, hey, if you want bigger deer, if you want more successful turkey broods, you've got to thin and you've got to burn. You need to produce that forage. You need to produce that brood habitat. And as more people do that, funny enough, those are the same things quail need, you know? So like, you know, creating good brood habitat for turkeys, that's pretty decent quail cover, you know. Thinning your pines and burning them on a 2-year rotation, that's exactly what I'd tell you to do. Well, you know, and with some changes occasionally in the timing, but in general, that would be your cookie cutter recommendation for bobwhite quail. So I'm excited. I think that, you know, as more landowners become more active managers on their property and really, you know, start managing for these species that we already have to, you know, and that's okay. I don't care why you're doing it, as long as it helps. But I think, you know, that I think we have a really good shot of, and like you said, 50s numbers. No, I mean, I'd love that. I would love to see that more than just about anything in this world. But certainly more quail than we knew, you and I knew growing up. I think that's very attainable, and we're already heading towards that.
That's what I feel like I've seen and heard more buzz around upland birds as a whole, and also quail specifically. And I think I think they can be attributed to a lot of things, but I think some bigger factors are quail forever, pheasants forever, things like prairie wildlife. There's a lot of things that, again, you can help to point to it, but
for sure, having
the feelings that I have about quail, I'm here to add more gasoline to the fire.
Absolutely, man. Well, welcome aboard. We'll take anybody we can get. So, but no, man, it's kind of an exciting time, and I think that's an important message for people to hear, at least in Mississippi, and really throughout the quail range, is it's possible. I think so many of us bought into the idea that it isn't. For so long, and I mean, you and I both did. Like, we started deer hunting.
I bought into it.
That's what we had.
I bought into it at a very young age because I remember them saying, I remember them hearing like, well, the quail's not here anymore, and I was like, oh, okay. But I did not think about those stories again until I went quail hunting in the Midwest, and I was like, well, why can't we?
Yeah, exactly. This is too much fun not to have here.
Why not? I'm a huge proponent in restoration projects with native animals to where they once were. You see it with black bears, you see it with elk, you see it with all kinds of stuff. But right now we're talking about quail, and I really do think there's hope there. So here's a question. I asked McConnell a similar question. So you said cautiously optimistic, so I'll word it the same way.
Sure.
If I were to say, take the cautious and throw it out, just give me the optimism.
Just optimism.
What is possible for quail in the Southeast in the next 2 years, 5 years, 10 years?
Man, okay, so I guess let me start by saying that I have nothing to base this on because this is, pretty. I'm just shooting from the hip here.
Sure.
So 2 to 5 years, 2 years, probably not a ton of change, but at the same time, I don't know what all's going on at every part of the country, right?
Sure.
Or every part of the state, I should say. Back to what we were kind of talking about before, I do see that increase in fire as a huge thing. Like that, the more we get that on the landscape, again, for whatever reason it is, the more private landowners can start burning, the more thinning we can do, even if we can do a little more heavy thinning in pines and that sort of stuff, and utilizing, creating more acreage that is, suitable for bobwhite quail. I think localized success over the next 2 to 5 years is very possible, if that makes sense.
It does.
What my hope would be over 10, 15, 20 career length type, type of time frame would be that, as some of those pockets build, that we end up creating connectivity between them and create more of a create a landscape that is more conducive to quail, and they start popping up more frequently in places. But it's crazy though. I say all that. I really do think we have quail pretty much everywhere in Mississippi, even as we speak. I don't think people realize how many quail we have. They really, like, almost any cutover I go to, anywhere where, there's been a recent timber clear cut. Like, if you sit out there long enough in the spring, you're going to hear a bobwhite quail, 2 or 3 years after that, that cutting. Because, that large-scale disturbance of removing all those trees and that canopy, you end up creating quail habitat, and they just pop up. It's like, again, don't care what your reason is, but like, you think, when you start thinking about all these patches of clear cuts across the state, it's like, well, there is patchy quail cover everywhere. And add on top of that, a couple folks who decide to thin a little lower and start burning for their turkeys, or people who've been doing that for a long time. We have landowners that do. You end up creating more of a happy picture, of like, oh, there might actually be a chance here. So one thing that I remember from when I was really, really young that we've kind of lost, I feel like in the state as a whole, I know there's still people who this doesn't apply to, but we're not tight with our neighbors anymore, you know? Have you noticed that as well?
Yeah.
It's because, like, I remember when I was a kid, like, if we needed to borrow a disc or you know, needed help with something or whatever else, you just call, you know, we just call the people down the street and, you know, and go get it and bring it back, or, you know, they'd do the same to us.
Yeah,
you know,
there's no issue.
You just did it. You just knew it was okay, because you knew everybody. And now everybody is so protective of, like, what they have and don't want to share and are afraid of getting sued or whatever else the case may be. And we've quit talking across fence lines. And like getting to know the people around us. And really, for a species like quail who needs that landscape level change to be successful, we have to put together some bigger blocks of, you know, property at some point, or like more connectivity of habitat. If we can ever, and there's, you know, the what am I trying to say? The like hunting cooperatives that are becoming a big thing now. I don't know how that'll turn out, but I'm very hopeful that actually gains some traction, because there's not just for quail, for a lot of wildlife species, there's a huge potential there.
Yeah, well, I mean, so that's interesting. That's like Harper was talking about, and he said it was like one thing that I hadn't thought about is it's like the time between when quail were very abundant down here to where they're not. He's like the average land ownership in acreage between then and now. Like now, I can't remember what it was exactly, but like then it was a couple hundred acres, and now the average land ownership is like maybe 12-ish acres.
Oh, wow.
And so if you, and to your point, in order to make a landscape level change, you have to have multiple landowners on the same page.
You do.
You have to.
Yeah. There's no way around it.
Yeah. And I hadn't I'd thought about that, but then applying that because I 100% agree with the sentiment that when I was younger, it was definitely there was a lot more communication.
Yeah.
Over
a sense of community, you know?
And I don't really know what to attribute that to.
I don't know.
The falling out of it, but I definitely agree with that it's happened.
Yeah.
It's an interesting line of thinking.
Yeah. And, you know, I think it's one of many things that have led to, you know, where we are now for sure. But it's not the leading contributor, but I do wish that there was more of that, because working together, we can do a lot more than we can, you know, by ourselves. And like, you know, there's a lot of people out there who aren't comfortable with prescribed fire or like these different management techniques, or just aren't as interested in wildlife, for example, as you and I are, or managing for deer or turkeys or whatever else. And, you know, may not have the tools necessary to do it. But if we all work together, you know, you're willing to help out your neighbor, learn that stuff, you know, or like, hey, we're having a burn. You want to come over and just learn about it, you know, and help us out, you know, carry a drip torch a little bit or something like that. You know, you can start creating advocates of the things that, you know, are helpful to the species of wildlife that you're trying to promote. They want you to learn more about it, right?
Yeah, of course.
You know, so much of the state is privately owned. We need private landowners if we're going to be successful, you know, managing it, you know, the public resource of wildlife. Yeah, it's going to take a lot of people. For sure. But I'm really excited about that. You know, that all that kind of slowed down with the pandemic and that sort of thing. But at this point, I know MDWFP is really trying to ramp up having those type of landowner workshops to, you know, teach about prescribed burning.
Gotcha.
And also, you know, the Mississippi Forestry Commission a couple times a year will have, you know, a course to certify people to be prescribed burn managers and stuff. And that's another great resource for people to look into. Yeah. You can learn a lot about it. And, you know, I wouldn't just take that course and start burning. You know, try to get a little experience as well. But but I mean, there are resources out there. And I'm excited that people are so excited about that, because, I mean, the quail's called the firebird for a reason, you know? It's like, I mean, they're so intrinsically tied to prescribed burning that, I mean, without it, you about don't have quail. Yeah. And that's another thing, you know, back in when we think about the early 1900s, the 1800s, like, we didn't have bush hogs. When something started looking snaky or was getting grown up, people just went and burned it.
Yeah.
That's how you cleared land, you know, and that definitely, you know, helped create a landscape that was, you know, way more conducive to bobwhite quail.
Yeah.
And that's another, to get back to something you kind of said earlier about like why we had quail and like why we don't now. Something that it's taken me a long time to realize is that we never managed for quail in the first place.
Yeah.
You know,
that's one thing that I've learned, and I've talked about that with several of the guys, is we almost had quail by default or by accident.
Mm-hmm. Oh, they were a happy byproduct. Yeah. We were real happy to have them, and we didn't do very much to keep them. But I think that's another problem too, is like we had quail because of the way we did business, right? Or the way we, you know, our economy and our landscape functioned. But we never put much into like actually figuring out, well, how do you make quail? So like, even though there are a lot of people like you and I who have, you know, these memories of quail as being part of their family, or, you know, slightly older than us who have a lot of memories of, you know, hunting quail, none of us really ever learned what the bird needed, or like how to make more of them, or, you know, we never went about managing a property specifically for bobwhite quail, by and large. And I'm generalizing, but you know, there are exceptions to everything, but by, you know, most of the public, we were just happy to have them while we did. And you know, and then in the 80s when we kind of ran out of them, people just quit owning bird dogs, you know, and moved on. So it's we've come a long way. But yeah, it's I think there's hope.
I do too.
Remaining cautiously optimistic. I like that. I really hope that you liked hearing from Mark McConnell and John Mark. I think they gave us a better understanding of what a quail needs habitat-wise, which in turn gives us all a better understanding as to why quail simply cannot exist the way that they used to in the current landscape that we have in the Southeast now. I hope that you'll come back next week. We have one more stop in this quail series where we're going to look at what we have going on now and what we could potentially look forward to in the future. As far as I'm concerned, there's definitely hope. If you have any questions, as always, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can hit the Primos page up or my personal page. I'm not hard to find. We'll catch you back here next week. As always, thank you so much for listening to the Speak the Language podcast presented by Onyx Hunt.